Before we dive in, let me know in the comments, have you ever seen someone get underestimated, only to surprise everyone? Margaret Harper walked slowly along the winding path of the park. It was a warm, peaceful afternoon. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the birds chirped a happy tune from the branches above. The park was alive with the quiet hum of life. Families picnicked on the grass, children giggled as they played, and joggers passed by with headphones in their ears. To anyone who looked at her, Margaret was just another elderly woman enjoying her day. She had grey hair, neatly tied back, and a soft, calm face with gentle eyes. She wore a long coat and a colorful scarf that fluttered slightly in the wind. She looked ordinary. But Margaret was not ordinary. You see, many years ago, Margaret Harper lived a very different life. Back then, no one called her grandma or ma'am. Back then, she was known by code names. She had worked for one of the most secret and powerful intelligence agencies in the world. Her job? Protecting people by taking down some of the most dangerous criminals on the planet. She had learned how to fight, how to disappear in a crowd, and how to stay 2 steps ahead of anyone chasing her. Margaret was once a spy, the kind of spy you see in movies, only smarter and deadlier. But now? Margaret was retired. She had left that dangerous world behind a long time ago. Life was quieter now. She liked her quiet walks through the park, her warm cups of tea, and her evenings reading mystery books. No one in the park knew her history, and that was just the way she liked it. Margaret smiled softly to herself as she walked past a couple holding hands on a park bench. She didn't need anyone to know who she used to be. She was happy blending into the background. It was peaceful this way. She thought to herself, I've earned this peace. But peace doesn't last forever. It all started when she noticed the sound of motorcycles in the distance. At first, it was faint, like a low rumble on the horizon. Margaret paused for a moment, her head tilting slightly as she listened. The rumble grew louder. The birds that had been chirping moments ago suddenly flew off, startled by the noise. Some of the families in the park looked around nervously. The sound wasn't normal here. It was rough and wild, breaking the calm of the afternoon like a crack of thunder. Margaret's instincts, the ones she had spent years training and then years trying to forget, kicked in. Her eyes scanned the park automatically. She didn't like this. Something felt off. A few moments later, 4 large motorcycles roared into view. Their engines echoed loudly, causing heads to turn. The bikes were sleek, painted in black and chrome, and their riders wore leather jackets with dark helmets. They weren't here for a relaxing ride. You could tell by the way they moved fast, aggressive, like they owned the place. The park's peaceful atmosphere vanished as the bikers revved their engines and circled a small fountain near the center of the pathway. Margaret kept walking, but now her senses were on high alert. Her calm face didn't change, but inside, she was already assessing the situation. How many were there? 4 riders, all male. 2 of them looked confident, their posture relaxed and cocky. One seemed a bit unsure, glancing around nervously like he wasn't quite comfortable being there. The leader, however, was easy to spot. He was the tallest of the group, and his body language screamed arrogance. He sat on his bike with one hand on the handlebars and the other resting lazily on his thigh, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Margaret sighed quietly. Of course, trouble always shows up when you least expect it, she thought. The bikers started making noise, revving their engines louder and laughing. They weren't just here to ride. They were here to show off and intimidate. Margaret watched as some parents quickly gathered their children and left the area. Joggers took detours to avoid the group. Even the park's security guards seemed hesitant to approach them. The bikers noticed the fear they were causing and seemed to enjoy it. Hey, look at that, one of them shouted, pointing toward Margaret. The leader turned his head in her direction and smirked. Well, well. Looks like we've got a brave one here. Still walking like nothing's happening, he said loudly. Margaret didn't react. She kept walking, her pace steady and calm. She wasn't about to be scared off. But the bikers weren't going to let her pass so easily. They revved their engines again, and two of them blocked the path ahead of her. Margaret stopped and looked up at them, her expression unreadable. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look angry. She just looked. "Hey, Grandma! You lost or something," one of the bikers sneered. He had a scar running across his cheek, and he grinned like he'd just said the funniest thing in the world. His friends laughed along with him. Margaret remained quiet for a moment, studying their faces. They were young, probably in their 20s, but old enough to know better. They had no idea who they were messing with. Finally, Margaret spoke. Her voice was calm and steady, but there was a certain edge to it, like a warning hidden in plain sight. "I'm not lost. But maybe you boys are," she said, her eyes locking on the leader. The leader's grin faltered for a second, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, is that right? And what are you gonna do about it, Grandma?" he taunted. Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, planting her feet firmly on the ground. It was a small movement, but it changed everything. To the untrained eye, she still looked like a harmless elderly woman. But anyone who had seen real combat would have recognized the subtle change. Margaret was ready to act if necessary. "I'm just here for a walk," she finally said. "But I'd appreciate it if you'd let me pass." The bikers exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of her calm confidence. The leader, however, wasn't ready to back down. He revved his engine one more time, making the bike roar like a wild beast. "Yeah? And what if we don't?" he challenged, leaning forward on his handlebars. Margaret sighed again. "These kids have no idea what kind of mistake they're making," she thought. But she kept her face neutral. There was no need to escalate things yet. "Then I guess you'll find out the hard way," she said quietly. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The leader laughed, but it sounded more forced this time. He didn't like how calm she was. People were supposed to be scared of him. That's how it usually worked. But Margaret wasn't scared. And that made him uneasy. The moment stretched on, tension crackling like static electricity in the air. Margaret could feel the adrenaline building inside her, but she stayed composed. She had been in situations far more dangerous than this. If these bikers thought they could intimidate her, they were in for a rude awakening. The breeze picked up again, ruffling her scarf. Margaret stood tall, unflinching, as the bikers revved their engines one last time. They had no idea who they were dealing with. But they were about to find out. The peaceful park, where birds had been chirping and families were relaxing, suddenly changed. A loud, deep rumble filled the air. Margaret Harper had just reached a quiet pathway when she heard it: motorcycles. The noise grew louder with each second, like a distant thunderstorm rolling in. Margaret paused, listening carefully. The sound wasn't the usual hum of traffic. It was different, aggressive and wild. Her eyes narrowed slightly as the noise approached. Within moments, 4 motorcycles appeared, roaring onto the park's main path. The riders were dressed in black leather jackets, some with chains and patches. Their helmets gleamed under the afternoon sun. These bikers weren't here to enjoy the scenery. They were loud, reckless, and intimidating. The bikers didn't slow down. They sped toward the fountain at the center of the park, scaring off anyone nearby. People hurried to get out of their way. Families grabbed their children and moved to a safer spot. Joggers stopped in their tracks, wide-eyed and unsure of what to do next. The bikers laughed loudly, revving their engines as if showing off. Their motorcycles circled the path, blocking anyone from passing through. The park, once peaceful and calm, now felt tense and dangerous. Margaret, however, didn't panic. She didn't rush away like everyone else. Instead, she continued walking at her own steady pace. Her calm movements seemed out of place in the chaotic scene. One of the bikers noticed her. He nudged the rider next to him and pointed. "Hey, look at that," he called out, loud enough for her to hear. The others turned to see what he was talking about. When they spotted Margaret, their grins widened. She was walking calmly, not even looking at them directly. "Hey, Grandma," one of them sneered, riding closer to her. His voice was mocking, full of fake friendliness. "You lost? Need someone to help you find the retirement home?" The other bikers burst out laughing at his joke. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar on his jaw, watched Margaret closely. He didn't laugh as much as the others. There was a glint of curiosity in his eyes, as if he were wondering why she wasn't scared like the others. Margaret finally stopped walking. She stood still in the middle of the path, looking at the bikers with a neutral expression. The wind tugged at her scarf, but she didn't flinch. The biker who had spoken earlier revved his engine again, making the motorcycle growl like a wild animal. He expected her to react, maybe to jump or show fear. But Margaret didn't move. She didn't even blink. "Well? You got something to say, Grandma?" he taunted. His grin widened, showing off crooked teeth. He was enjoying this, thinking he had all the power. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying the group. There were 4 of them in total. 2 of them looked overly confident, like they had done this kind of thing many times before. They were used to bullying others for fun. The third one, however, seemed different. His eyes darted around nervously. His hands weren't steady on the handlebars. Margaret recognized the signs he was new to this. Maybe he wasn't fully comfortable with the way things were playing out. But the 4th biker, the leader, was the one Margaret kept her focus on. He hadn't said much yet, but she could tell he was in charge. The way the others followed his lead made it obvious. He exuded a quiet arrogance, like someone who was used to being in control. Margaret smiled softly, just for a moment. It wasn't a warm or friendly smile. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. But to anyone paying attention, it hinted at something deeper. The bikers, however, weren't paying attention to small details. They saw only what they wanted to see: a frail old woman who had no business standing up to them. "Easy prey. Maybe she can't hear us," one of the other bikers joked, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hey! You okay, lady?" The others laughed again, their voices echoing across the park. A few people nearby watched from a distance, too afraid to intervene but curious about what would happen next. Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was calm and steady, with just a hint of amusement. "I can hear you just fine," she said. The bikers stopped laughing, surprised by her response. "Oh, she talks," the first biker said with mock surprise. "Well, that's good. So, tell me, Grandma, what are you doing here all alone? Isn't it past your bedtime?" More laughter. Margaret remained unfazed. She looked the biker straight in the eye, holding his gaze without fear. "I'm just here for a walk," she replied simply. "But it seems you boys are the ones making all the noise." The leader leaned forward on his bike, resting his arms on the handlebars. He was intrigued now. Most people would have run away by this point. But not this woman. She was too calm. Too different. "And what if we are?" he asked, his tone quieter but more serious. The laughter from the others died down as they waited for Margaret's answer. Margaret took a slow step forward. The leader's eyes followed her movements carefully. "Then I suggest you move along and let me pass," she said, her voice still steady. The boldness of her words caught the bikers off guard. For a moment, there was silence. The leader's expression hardened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. "Or what?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "Or you'll regret it," she said softly, almost like a whisper. But the words carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably. They could sense that something had changed. The atmosphere around them felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. The nervous biker, the one who hadn't spoken much, cleared his throat. "Hey, maybe we should just leave her alone," he muttered quietly, glancing at the leader. The leader glared at him, annoyed. "What's wrong with you? She's just an old lady," he snapped. But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his eyes. There was something about Margaret that unsettled him. Margaret stood perfectly still, her posture relaxed but ready. She had been in far more dangerous situations than this. These bikers had no idea who they were dealing with. "You're making a mistake," she said calmly. The leader hesitated, his fingers tightening on the handlebars. He didn't want to admit it, but a part of him was starting to believe her. He had learned over the years to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were screaming at him to back off. But his pride wouldn't let him. "Not yet." Margaret sighed quietly. They never learn until it's too late, she thought. But she didn't mind. If they wanted to test her, she was more than capable of teaching them a lesson. The tension in the air grew thicker as the standoff continued. The park was eerily quiet now. Even the distant sound of birds had faded away. Margaret remained calm, her eyes never leaving the leader. He had a choice to make. But one thing was certain: this was a day neither he nor his friends would ever forget. The bikers kept taunting Margaret. Their words were sharp, filled with disrespect, like bullies trying to get a reaction. "What's the matter, Grandma?" one biker jeered. "Cat got your tongue." Another added, "Maybe she's waiting for someone to come save her. Too bad there's no one around." They laughed, revving their engines again, making the motorcycles snarl like angry beasts. The sound echoed through the park, causing a few bystanders to move farther away. The bikers seemed to enjoy the attention. But Margaret didn't flinch. She stood still, her face calm and unreadable. Margaret wasn't focused on their insults. Her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't afraid of these men, not even a little. Decades of training had taught her to stay in control under pressure. This situation might have scared someone else, but to her, it was just like any other high-stakes operation she had handled before. She observed the bikers closely, letting her trained eyes gather all the details. In just a few seconds, she knew everything she needed to know. 4 men. 3 armed. 1 nervous. Margaret's gaze settled on the nervous one. He was the youngest of the group, probably in his early 20s. His hands kept fidgeting near his jacket pocket, and he avoided looking directly at her. His unease was obvious. Margaret could tell he wasn't fully comfortable with what they were doing. Maybe this was his first time being part of something like this. "He's not a problem," she thought, filing that information away. Next, she glanced at the 2 who were loud and overconfident. They were the troublemakers, enjoying the power they thought they had. They kept exchanging grins, egging each other on, as if trying to impress their leader. Margaret could tell they were followers, not leaders. Finally, her eyes rested on the leader himself. He was the tallest and most composed of the group. He didn't speak as much as the others, but when he did, the others listened. His posture was relaxed, but there was an edge to him, like someone who had been in control for a long time. He wasn't just a show-off, he was dangerous in a more subtle way. Margaret knew his type well. "He's the one to watch," she noted. She quickly scanned her surroundings. The path was wide but lined with trees and benches. She mentally mapped out possible escape routes. There were a few side paths leading deeper into the park and several large trees she could use for cover if things got messy. She wasn't planning to run, but it was always good to have options. Despite all the calculations going through her mind, Margaret didn't show any sign of worry. To the bikers, she looked like a harmless old woman standing in the middle of the path. But inside, Margaret was already planning her next move. Then, instead of walking away like most people would, she did something that caught the bikers off guard. She stepped forward, moving slowly but with purpose, until she was standing right in front of their leader. She raised her head and met his gaze directly, her eyes steady and fearless. The leader didn't move. He stared back at her, his brow furrowing slightly. He wasn't used to people looking at him like that without fear. It made him uneasy, though he didn't show it. Margaret broke the silence with a soft, casual remark. "You boys must be bored," she said lightly, her tone almost playful. "It's a shame. All this energy, wasted." For the first time since the encounter started, the bikers stopped laughing. They exchanged confused glances, unsure how to react. "Excuse me," the leader finally said, his voice low and skeptical. Margaret shrugged, her expression calm. "All this noise, all these tricks. Is this really how you spend your afternoons?" The leader's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone like her. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his tone sharper now. Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if she were genuinely curious. "Well, you're clearly looking for something. Maybe attention? Or are you just trying to prove something to yourselves?" The other bikers fidgeted uncomfortably. This wasn't going the way they had expected. Most people would be scared, begging them to leave. But this woman wasn't afraid at all. She was talking to them like they were schoolboys caught causing trouble. One of the louder bikers, the one with a scar on his cheek, tried to regain control of the situation. He stepped forward and sneered, "You've got a smart mouth for an old lady. You should watch what you say." Margaret turned her gaze to him, her expression calm but firm. "Oh? And what are you going to do about it?" The biker blinked, momentarily thrown off by her response. He hadn't expected her to challenge him so directly. The leader shot him a warning look, silently telling him to back off. Margaret noticed the silent exchange and smiled inwardly. Step 1, disarm them with words. Step 2, make them question themselves, she thought. The leader took a step forward, placing himself between Margaret and his men. "Look," he said, trying to sound authoritative, "we're just having some fun. You should mind your business and keep walking." Margaret didn't move. She stood her ground, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Is that what you call fun? Intimidating people who can't fight back?" The leader's jaw tightened. He didn't like where this conversation was headed. His control over the situation was slipping, and he knew it. "You don't know anything about us," he said coldly. Margaret nodded slowly. "You're right. I don't know your stories. But I do know one thing." The leader raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? And what's that?" Margaret leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "People who need to scare others to feel powerful, they're usually the most afraid." The words hit like a punch. The leader's face darkened, and the atmosphere around them grew tense. The other bikers shifted nervously, unsure of what would happen next. The nervous biker, the youngest of the group, spoke up hesitantly. "Maybe we should just go. We don't need this kind of trouble." The leader shot him a glare. "Quiet," he snapped. Margaret watched the exchange closely. The cracks in their unity were starting to show. She had planted seeds of doubt, and now it was only a matter of time before those doubts grew. Still, the leader wasn't ready to back down just yet. His pride wouldn't let him. He took another step toward Margaret, standing close enough to tower over her. "You think you're clever, huh?" he growled. Margaret didn't back away. Instead, she met his gaze with quiet confidence. "I don't need to be clever," she said softly. "I just need to be prepared." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The leader stared at her, trying to figure her out. Something about her was different. She didn't act like a helpless victim. She acted like someone who had faced danger before, someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Finally, the leader exhaled sharply and stepped back. "Let's go," he muttered, motioning to his men. The bikers hesitated for a moment, then slowly backed off, their engines rumbling to life again. Margaret watched silently as they rode away, disappearing down the path. When the park was quiet once more, she let out a small breath. The situation had been defused without violence, just as she had planned. But she knew it wasn't over. They'll be back, she thought. And next time, they won't be so easy to handle. Margaret adjusted her scarf and resumed her walk, her mind already preparing for the next encounter. The calm had returned for now. But deep down, she knew the storm wasn't far behind. Things happened so fast, it was hard to believe. One of the bikers, frustrated by Margaret's calm attitude, decided he'd had enough. He wasn't going to let some old lady make them look like fools. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path, and reached out to grab her arm. "Let's see you act tough now," he sneered. "Big mistake." The moment his hand touched her, Margaret's body reacted like lightning. With a swift movement, she grabbed his wrist, twisted it sharply, and applied just enough pressure to send him crashing to his knees. "Ah! Let go! Let go!" he cried out, his face twisting in pain. He wasn't expecting that. None of them were. The other bikers froze, their mouths hanging open in shock. Their tough friend, the one who loved showing off, was now helpless on the ground, clutching his wrist. Margaret stood over him, her eyes cold and steady. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look tired. It was as if what she had done was as simple as tying her shoes. She loosened her grip slightly, letting the biker catch his breath, but she didn't fully release him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Margaret said in a calm, low voice. Despite how quietly she spoke, the authority in her tone made everyone tense up. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The leader of the bikers took a step forward, his jaw tightening. He wasn't laughing anymore. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he growled. Margaret finally let go of the biker on the ground, who scrambled backward like a frightened child. He clutched his wrist and stared at her, wide-eyed. "She's crazy, man. She's some kind of fighter or something," he gasped. Margaret didn't move from her spot. She stood calmly, her hands relaxed by her sides. But every muscle in her body was ready for action. Years of training kicked in like second nature. She knew exactly how to control the situation. The leader glared at her, his pride wounded. No one made him or his crew look weak, especially not someone like her. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small knife. Its blade glinted in the sunlight. "Oh, so you think you're tough," he snarled. "Let's see how tough you really are." The other bikers hesitated, glancing nervously between Margaret and their leader. They weren't sure what to do. This wasn't going the way they had planned. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly as she saw the knife. Her mind worked quickly. She had handled situations far more dangerous than this. Weapons didn't scare her, they just gave her more opportunities to end things quickly. The leader lunged at her, the knife aimed directly at her. But Margaret was faster. In a single, fluid motion, she sidestepped his attack, grabbed his arm, and struck his wrist with pinpoint accuracy. The knife flew from his hand, clattering to the ground several feet away. Before he could react, she delivered a swift kick to the back of his knee, forcing him to stumble forward. She moved like a shadow, silent, precise, and impossible to predict. The other bikers were frozen in place. Their leader, the man they had always followed without question, was now struggling on the ground, disarmed and humiliated. "Stay down," Margaret said firmly, her voice steady and unshakable. She glanced at the knife on the ground and gave it a small nudge with her foot, sending it farther out of reach. The leader glared up at her, his face red with anger and embarrassment. He tried to stand, but Margaret stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him hesitate. "I don't want to hurt you," she said. "But if you keep pushing, I won't hold back next time." There was something in her voice, something that made the bikers shiver. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was calm, controlled, and deadly serious. They realized, maybe for the first time, that they were completely outmatched. Who are you?" one of the other bikers stammered, his voice trembling. Margaret chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Just someone who's been around the block a few times," she replied. The nervous biker, the youngest of the group, finally spoke up. "We should go," he whispered urgently to the others. "This isn't worth it. She's not normal." The leader clenched his fists, his pride warring with his common sense. He didn't want to back down in front of his crew, but he also knew Margaret wasn't bluffing. She had taken him down without breaking a sweat. If he pushed her any further, things would only get worse. "Fine," he spat, standing up slowly. He wiped the dust off his jacket and shot Margaret a venomous glare. "You got lucky today, old lady." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Is that what you think?" "Luck." The leader didn't answer. He motioned for his crew to follow him. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances before reluctantly starting their engines. The sound of the motorcycles filled the park again as they prepared to leave. Before they rode off, the leader pointed a finger at Margaret. "We'll see you around," he said, his voice full of empty bravado. Margaret didn't respond. She simply watched them drive away, her expression unreadable. The tension in the air slowly faded as the sound of the motorcycles grew distant. When they were finally gone, the park seemed to breathe again. The birds returned to their trees, and the few remaining bystanders came out from their hiding spots, whispering in awe. "Did you see that?" one man murmured to his friend. "She took them down like it was nothing." "Who is she?" another whispered. Margaret sighed softly and adjusted her scarf. She wasn't interested in explaining herself to anyone. This wasn't the first time she had faced trouble, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Still, she preferred a quiet life. Hopefully, the bikers had learned their lesson and wouldn't come back. As she resumed her walk, a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. It felt good to be in control, to remind herself that she still had what it took. She had spent years training to protect others, and those skills didn't just disappear with age. Sometimes, people judged by appearances. They saw gray hair and wrinkles and assumed weakness. But appearances could be deceiving. Margaret knew that better than anyone. With a calm stride, she continued down the path, leaving behind whispers of wonder and admiration. The park had returned to its peaceful rhythm, but for those who had witnessed the event, the story of the mysterious elderly woman would be told for a long time to come. Not long after the bikers sped off, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Margaret continued her walk, calm and steady, as though nothing had happened. She had no reason to worry. Trouble had come and gone, and she had dealt with it just like she always did, swiftly and quietly. But the scene hadn't gone unnoticed. Several witnesses had called park security and the police. People who had hidden behind benches and trees earlier were now cautiously stepping out. They were still whispering about what they had seen. Some looked at Margaret with wide eyes, as if she were some kind of superhero. A young couple approached her hesitantly. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice soft and full of concern. Margaret smiled kindly. "Oh, I'm fine. Thank you for asking," she replied. Before the couple could say more, a golf cart with park security officers rolled up. Two uniformed guards hopped out, their eyes scanning the area. "We got reports of an incident," one of them said, walking toward Margaret. "Some kind of fight involving bikers?" Margaret nodded politely. "Yes, there were some troublemakers here," she said. "But they've already left." The second officer frowned. "We heard they were causing a lot of trouble." "Did anyone get hurt?" "No," Margaret answered simply. "I made sure of that." The guards exchanged glances, clearly puzzled. "Wait, are you saying you handled them by yourself?" Margaret didn't reply right away. She didn't like drawing attention to herself. But she knew the truth would come out sooner or later. The witnesses were already whispering and pointing in her direction. "She's not lying," an older man nearby spoke up. "I saw the whole thing. Those guys tried to mess with her, and she took them down like it was nothing." "Yeah," a teenager added excitedly. "She twisted that one guy's arm and made him scream like a baby." The security officers looked at Margaret with newfound respect and a bit of disbelief. One of them shook his head in amazement. "Well, ma'am, I don't know who you are, but, thank you. You might have saved some people today." Margaret gave a small nod. "Just doing what needed to be done," she said modestly. Just then, the sound of motorcycles returned. The bikers hadn't gotten far. Police cars and more security vehicles were blocking the exits of the park. The officers had set up a perimeter to prevent anyone from leaving. Within moments, the bikers were forced to stop, surrounded on all sides. "Step off the bikes," one officer commanded through a loudspeaker. The bikers hesitated for a moment, glancing at each other nervously. They hadn't expected things to get this serious. Slowly, they dismounted their motorcycles and raised their hands. Park security officers and police quickly moved in, confiscating weapons and patting them down for any other dangerous items. The leader of the gang scowled but didn't resist. He knew there was no point in fighting now. Margaret watched from a distance as the bikers were rounded up. One by one, they were handcuffed and lined up against the park fence. The leader glared at the officers but said nothing. His tough guy act was crumbling fast. As the officers led the bikers past Margaret, the leader finally broke his silence. He slowed down and looked at her with a mix of confusion and disbelief. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to figure her out. "You're not just some old lady," he muttered under his breath. Margaret smiled faintly, her expression calm but knowing. "No," she replied softly. "I'm not." The leader shook his head, as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. He didn't say anything else as the officers escorted him away. The other bikers looked equally stunned. None of them dared to make eye contact with her. The scene settled down after that. The officers continued questioning witnesses and writing reports. People in the park gathered in small groups, chatting about what they had just seen. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. "Did you see her? She was like a ninja or something," one man said to his friend. "I heard she's some kind of retired cop," another woman whispered. "Maybe even ex-military." "No way," someone else chimed in. "She's gotta be a secret agent. Did you see the way she moved? It was like in the movies." Margaret overheard bits and pieces of the conversations but paid them no mind. She had been through situations like this before. People always speculated when they saw something out of the ordinary. It was human nature. A little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed at Margaret. "Mommy, is that lady a superhero?" she asked in awe. The mother chuckled softly. "She sure seems like one," she said, smiling at Margaret. Margaret gave the girl a gentle wave before continuing her walk. She didn't want to stick around too long. The attention made her uncomfortable. All she wanted was a quiet life, free from the chaos of her past. But sometimes, the past had a way of catching up with her. As she strolled along the path, Margaret reflected on what had just happened. The bikers had underestimated her because of her age. They saw grey hair and wrinkles and assumed she was weak. It was a mistake people often made. But Margaret knew better. Strength wasn't always about appearances. Sometimes, the most powerful people are the ones you least expect, she thought. By the time she reached the other side of the park, the excitement had died down. The police and security officers were wrapping up their work, and the crowd had mostly dispersed. Life in the park returned to normal. Children played on the swings again, joggers resumed their runs, and the birds began chirping in the trees once more. Margaret found a quiet bench near a flower garden and sat down. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warm breeze wash over her. For the first time that afternoon, she felt truly at peace. She didn't need recognition or praise. She didn't need anyone to know who she really was. All she needed was a moment of calm in a world that could be chaotic and unpredictable. A young officer approached her cautiously, breaking her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said respectfully. "I just wanted to say thank you again. What you did today, well, it's not something we see every day." Margaret opened her eyes and smiled gently. "You're welcome," she said. The officer hesitated for a moment, then asked, "If you don't mind me asking, where did you learn to do that?" Margaret chuckled softly. "Oh, I've just been around the block a few times," she replied, repeating the words she had told the bikers. The officer nodded, though he still looked curious. "Well, whatever your story is, you're impressive. Stay safe, ma'am." "Always," Margaret said with a wink. As the officer walked away, Margaret leaned back on the bench and sighed contentedly. Today had been an unexpected adventure, but she knew she could handle whatever life threw at her. After all, she had spent years facing challenges most people couldn't even imagine. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small book, a mystery novel she had been reading. With a peaceful smile, she opened it and began to read. Life was unpredictable, but Margaret knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just an ordinary woman. And no matter how quiet her life became, there would always be moments where her skills were needed. She didn't seek out danger, but if it found her, she'd be ready. And for now, that was enough. Margaret walked slowly down the park path, her shoes softly crunching the gravel beneath her feet. The breeze played gently with her scarf, tugging it like a playful child. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, painting the clouds with warm shades of gold and pink. It was peaceful now, the kind of peace Margaret cherished. The excitement from earlier had passed, but Margaret couldn't help thinking about it. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. Trouble always had a way of finding her, no matter how much she tried to avoid it. But this time, it wasn't just trouble, it was a reminder of something she had learned long ago. Margaret's thoughts drifted back to her younger days. Back then, she was part of a secret world, one filled with danger and high-stakes missions. People often assumed she wasn't capable of much just by looking at her. After all, she wasn't tall or loud, and she didn't walk around looking tough. She had lost count of how many people had underestimated her. Some had laughed, thinking she was an easy target. Others had dismissed her as harmless. But those people never saw what was coming. "People will always underestimate those who appear weak," she whispered to herself as she walked. It was a simple truth, one she had carried with her through all her years of service and beyond. Many people judged others by their looks alone. They didn't understand that strength could take many forms. Margaret paused by a large oak tree, its branches arching like a canopy over the path. She reached out to touch the rough bark, her fingers tracing the deep grooves. Trees like this had stood for decades, weathering storms and strong winds. They didn't shout about their strength, but they endured, quietly holding their ground. That was the kind of strength Margaret admired the most, the quiet kind. Her thoughts returned to the bikers. They had thought they were in control, that they could scare anyone with their loud engines and sneering words. But their strength was just noise, temporary, fleeting. Real strength wasn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive. It was about knowing who you were, staying calm in the face of fear, and acting when the time was right. Margaret adjusted her scarf, smoothing it down over her coat. The material was soft and warm, a comforting presence. She thought about how different her life had become since she retired. She had chosen a quieter path, one without the constant danger and high tension of her old job. But moments like today reminded her that some skills never faded. "You don't have to be loud to be strong," she murmured under her breath. It was a lesson she wished more people understood. Strength could be kindness in the face of cruelty, patience when others were rushing, or wisdom when faced with confusion. As she continued her walk, a small child ran past her, chasing after a colorful kite. His laughter echoed through the park, light and joyful. Margaret smiled at the sight. The child's mother called out gently from a nearby bench, telling him not to run too far. The boy waved in response, too caught up in the excitement to fully listen. Watching them brought a sense of warmth to Margaret's heart. Moments like these were precious. They were the reason she had fought so hard in the past to protect the simple joys of everyday life. Not everyone knew how fragile peace could be, how easily it could be broken. But Margaret did. She had seen what happened when people let fear and violence take over. She took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. Each step she took felt lighter now, as though a weight had been lifted. She had done her part today, and that was enough. The bikers had learned their lesson, and she doubted they would be causing trouble in the park again anytime soon. Margaret's mind wandered to the bystanders who had witnessed the encounter. She wondered what they thought of her. No doubt, rumors would spread. People would talk about the mysterious woman who had stood up to a gang without breaking a sweat. Some might call her a hero. Others might create wild stories about her past. But Margaret didn't care about any of that. She didn't need recognition or fame. True strength didn't require applause. She had spent years in the shadows, working quietly to keep others safe. It was enough for her to know she had made a difference. As she passed a small pond, Margaret stopped to watch the ducks paddling in the water. They floated calmly, their movements smooth and effortless. Yet beneath the surface, their webbed feet moved quickly, keeping them balanced and in control. Balance, Margaret thought. That was another important part of strength. It wasn't just about reacting to danger, it was about knowing when to act and when to stay still. Not every battle needed to be fought with fists. Sometimes, the greatest victories came from staying calm, observing, and waiting for the right moment. Her reflection rippled in the water as a soft breeze brushed the surface. For a moment, she saw herself as others might, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a gentle presence. But she knew there was more to her than what met the eye. Beneath that calm exterior was a core of steel, forged by years of experience. Margaret's thoughts shifted to the young biker who had seemed nervous during the confrontation. He had looked like he didn't fully belong with the group, like he was unsure of his role. Maybe today's events had shaken him enough to reconsider his choices. People can change, she thought. It wasn't always easy, but sometimes, moments like today could open a person's eyes. She hoped that young man would find a better path. Margaret resumed her walk, feeling the steady rhythm of her steps. The path curved gently ahead, leading her deeper into the park. She noticed a few familiar faces along the way, neighbors, joggers, and regular visitors. Some nodded politely as she passed, while others gave her curious looks. One older man sitting on a bench raised his hand in greeting. "Nice day for a walk, isn't it?" he said with a friendly smile. "Beautiful day," Margaret agreed, returning the smile. They exchanged a few pleasantries before she continued on her way. The conversation was simple, but it reminded her of the importance of connection. In a world that could be chaotic and unpredictable, small moments of kindness mattered. They were the threads that held communities together. Margaret reached the edge of the park, where a row of tall trees marked the boundary between nature and the city beyond. The streets were busier here, with cars honking and pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalks. Life went on as usual, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the park earlier. She paused for a moment, taking in the contrast between the peaceful greenery behind her and the bustling world ahead. Both were part of life, each with its own challenges and rewards. Margaret had learned to navigate both with grace, finding strength in balance and quiet resilience. As she stepped out onto the sidewalk, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She might not seek out trouble, but if it ever found her again, she would be ready. Strength didn't have to be loud, it could be steady, calm, and enduring. Margaret adjusted her scarf one last time and smiled to herself. Life had taught her many lessons, but this one remained close to her heart. Sometimes, the quietest power is the most dangerous of all. With that thought, she walked on, blending into the crowd like any other ordinary person. But those who truly understood knew better. Margaret Harper was anything but ordinary. And that was her greatest strength.